So far in the course, we have always used the regular functions where we have function keyword, then we have the name of the function, parentheses where we pass in the parameters, and then once we invoke it, of course, we call them arguments, and then within the curly braces, that's where we set up our functionality. So if I just have a basic functionality of console log hello, that's exactly what I'm getting in console. And we also looked at that we can have function expressions where we have the variable, then we set it equal to a function. And then if we would want to invoke it, of course, we invoke the variable name and then whatever parameters we would want to pass in. If there's no parameters, of course, we're not passing them. But if we have parameter, then we just pass it as an argument. And then again, whatever functionality we would want within the curly braces. In this case, I just have hello and then whatever name I'm passing. Now, that's the reason why I have hello Bob in the console. And lastly, if we want multiple parameters, we just separate them by commas. With an arrival of ES6, we have a different way how we can set up the functions. And we can use arrow functions, or they're also called fat arrow functions. So what are the key features of arrow functions? First of all, they have no name. So we're always going to have to set them up as an expression. Essentially, we're always going to have to assign them to a variable unless we're passing them in as a callback. And don't worry, we're going to get there. And also, they don't have a function keyword. So when we're setting up the arrow functions, we don't need to use a function keyword. And then they have the implicit return, and they treat this, so the magic this keyword in JavaScript, they treat it differently. Now we're going to spend a separate video on this. So now let's focus on the basics. And since I would want to keep it for your reference, I am going to comment this out like so. Let's save that. And then before we start setting up the arrow functions in the index.html, I just have a simple button that has the text of click me. And then I just added a bit of CSS just so it looks better. And I guess let's set up our first example using the arrow function. Remember, our first one was function that just said hi. And then it was a simple one-liner where we had console log and then we console logged hello. And like I mentioned previously, we need to set this up as a function expression. So I need to have a variable and I'm going to have my variable the same. And I'm going to set this as say hi. And then we need to pass in the parentheses. Then we have our fat arrow sign, which essentially is a equal sign and then greater than sign. That is our fat arrow function. And then since we don't have the multiple lines in our code, as well as since we just have a one-liner, well, I can just omit the curly braces. I don't need the curly braces, and I don't also need the return statement. What I can do is I can just type log and hello. So whatever my one-liner is, whatever functionality you have here. Now, obviously, you're not limited to just console logging, but please understand if you have one line in your function, then you can right away omit both the curly braces as well as a return statement. We save it, and then, of course, we need to invoke it. So I'm going to go with say hi. Then I invoke it, and then in the console, of course, I'm going to have the hello. Why do I have hello? Because that is my function. So this is a arrow function. Again, we have parentheses, then we have our arrow function sign, and then console log, or whatever one-liner we would have there. All right. So now let's look at a different example, where in fact we're passing in one parameter. How is that going to look like? And I'm going to use this example where I have the triple, but I'm just going to name this double. So again, we need to come up with a variable name. This is going to be double. Then if I'm passing in one parameter, I can omit the parentheses. So I could just type in value, and this is going to be the parameter that I'm passing in. Since again, my code is just going to be one line, I can omit the curly braces as well as the return statement. And I can say value, and let's just multiply this by 2. And of course, we can invoke it, but in order to see the result, we would want to assign this to some kind of variable, correct? Otherwise, this is just going to be returned, so we're not going to console log anything. And the way I'm going to set this up, there's going to be a number. Number is going to be equal to a double. I'm going to pass in some kind of value as my argument. Well, let's say I'm going to go with 4. And then if we console log it, what do you think is going to happen? What is going to be our value? Well, let's think about it. We have our function. The function takes one parameter, and then we just multiply this parameter. So if I'm invoking my function and then passing 4, I should have 8 in the console. And there you go. We have the 8. Now let's also take a look at another example where we're passing in 2 parameters in the function as well as if there's more functionality than just one line in the curly braces. Because so far we have just looked at, all right, so I have one line in my function body. Fine, awesome. I can just omit the curly braces and return. The same one here. But what happens if we have more lines of code in our function body? And the way we're going to test this out, first of all, I'm going to write 2 parameters and more than one line, like so. That is going to be my comment. And I'm going to set this up as multiply. So let's go with const multiply. And then if we pass in 2 parameters, we do have to use parentheses again. When we used 1 parameter, we could omit the parentheses. But then when we use 2, 3, 4, whatever, more than 1 parameter, we always need to use the parentheses. So in this case, I'm going to go with num1 and a num2. And also, if we have more than just one line in the function body, we need to set this up a bit differently, where we do use the curly braces. That's step number 1. And then, of course, we set up our functionality. So let's go with const result, then a num1 multiplied by num2. And in this case, we're just going to imagine that there's going to be more functionality. So I'm going to say here, more code here. And if that is the scenario, if you would want to return, of course, your result, you need to explicitly write a return result. So that would be a difference. Again, if you have one line, arrow functions have implicit return. So this value is always going to be returned if you're writing it in this fashion. However, if you have multiple lines, you need to make sure that you explicitly return. Since in this case, we are setting the curly braces, and now I'm saying, all right, so I would want to return the result. How we can check that? Again, we're going to set up some kind of variable just because we're returning. So I would want to see that. So I'm going to go with sum. Then sum is going to be equal to a multiply. That is, of course, my function name. And in this case, I'm going to pass in, 4 and 5 or 6 as my arguments. And let's just console log the sum. So we're going to go with sum. And we shouldn't be surprised if we see 24. Again, why we have 24? Because in the function body, of course, we have the result, which is one argument multiplied by the other one. Again, the key difference, if you have more lines of code, make sure you add the curly braces and then you explicitly return. If you have one liner, simple. Omit the curly braces and just type whatever you would want to return from the function, whether that is some kind of console log or that is actual value. So in our case, it was value multiplied by 2. Now let's take a look at what happens if we're returning the object. Because let's think about it. Objects by themselves right away have the curly braces, right? So how would that work? And I'm going to go by setting up const. And you know what? I am going to add also a comment. So I'm going to go with return object, just so we know what we're doing. And I'm just going to call this object. That is going to be my variable. Again, we have the function expression, of course. I'm not passing any parameters, so I'm just passing in the parentheses. And then if I would want to return the object, you're going to notice that there's going to be an error if I just type the curly braces. So let's say I'm going to go here, name, and then I'm going to write this as John, and then age is going to be, 25. So this is going to give me an error. Why? Well, because JavaScript is right now confused. It's like, okay, so you're setting up the curly braces, but then within the curly braces, you are using the syntax that you would use for the object. And in order to avoid that, if we're returning the object, we need to make sure that we just set up here like this, the parentheses. So now let's save it. And then, of course, if we would want to check it out, again, we're going to have const person, and I'm going to scroll down just so you can see better. And that is going to be equal to an object, then I invoke it. And then if we're going to console log it in a console, we're going to see that our person is named John and then age 24. Now, what's really interesting is that we can also use arrow functions as callback functions. And in my opinion, this is where they really shine, because you're going to see how they simplify the actual syntax. Please keep in mind, though, when we're talking about callback functions, there's 2 ways how we can write that. We can write them as anonymous functions and pass there and then, or we can set them up separately and use an expression. In this case, we're talking about as anonymous functions. We're just passing them there and then. If you would, of course, set them up separately, again, you would need to use the function expression, where you would set up the function and then pass it as a callback function. And two ways how we can test it out is by looking at a filter method, because remember that was one of the array methods that was looking for the callback function, because that callback function was applied to each and every item in an array. And the second one was the event listener. When we set up the event listener, then we had an option of either passing it as an anonymous function or we set up the reference. And in order to show you how it works, I'm going to add first comment arrow functions as callback functions like so. And we're going to go with const numbers. So I'm going to quickly create some kind of array. Now it's going to be a very simple array. We're just going to have numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then I would want to get the numbers that are only bigger than 2. First, I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to say the variable is going to be big. Then remember we had numbers and we had a filter method. So we have a filter method. And then within the filter method, we're passing in the callback function. So if we're setting this up as an anonymous function and we're using the arrow function, well, what we would want within a callback function, each and every parameter reference the item in my array. So if I know that when I'm using the arrow function, if I have one parameter, I don't need to use the parentheses, I can just say number. And then what I would want to do? Well, I would want to right away a return number only if it is bigger than 2. Does that require multiple lines of code or no? I think not. So we set up our arrow function, of course, as our callback function. And we right away know that I don't need to use the curly braces. I don't need to use the return since it's just a one-liner. So I'm going to say if number is bigger than 2, then please return it. And this is going to be right now my big array. Then we're going to console log it. And you're going to see that we're going to have only numbers that are bigger than 2. In the console, I have the array with numbers or values, I guess, with 3, 4, 5, 6. And there you go. That's how easy it was. Again, this is where, in my opinion, arrow functions truly shine, where you don't have to set up the function, then a curly brace, and then set up all the logic. You can just simply say, all right, this is going to be my arrow function. If I'm, of course, passing in 2 parameters, then, of course, I would need to set up the parentheses. So if imagine that you have a number as well as index, it would be a bit different. Because remember, that was the second argument that we can access. And also in this case, if I would want to console log the index, then, of course, I need to set up the curly braces because I need to make sure that I have multiple values here. So let me start a new line here. And then this is going to be right now an explicit return. So I'm going to say return number, but I also would want to console log each and every index. So I'm going to go with log index. And in this case, the functionality didn't change. So I'm still getting 3, 4, 5, 6, but I'm also console logging the index. So please keep in mind the rules still apply here, even though we're passing this as an anonymous callback function. But if we have 2 parameters, then we need to use the parentheses. And then if we have more lines of code, then we still need to set up the curly braces. But still, in my opinion, it is a bit faster and a bit more concise. And lastly, we're just going to check it out how we can set arrow functions as a add event listener callback function. And I have the button in my index.html. Let me save it. And of course, the class is btn because that is the most simplest one. And I'm going to assign this to some kind of variable. So I'm going to go with const btn is equal to document, then query selector. We're going to go with our class of btn. And then once I have my variable, then of course I can just say btn add event listener. I got my node back. And I'm going to be listening for click events. And the same how we worked previously with a filter. I can just pass here the comma. And I'm going to go with the simplest function body ever. I'm just going to console log it. So I'm going to go with console log. And again, we can omit the curly braces. We can omit the return statement if we're just simply console logging. Normally, of course, you would have more functionality than that. But in this case, I'm going to go, you clicked me. We're going to save it. And then as I'm clicking on a button, of course, in a console, I have you clicked me.